Thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Hamel, and thanks for sticking around to what's the end of your day. I'm in California, and it's 2 o'clock here, and I'm going to do a presentation that's adapted from one that I gave at the office. I work at Ready at Dawn, which is an independent developer in California near the UC Irvine campus. I adapted this based on some of my past experiences and gave it to the team at work. And I thought it would be interesting for you guys as well to have a version of it that's for public consumption. So it's called Between Jumping and Fighting, Puzzle Design Best Practices in Action Adventure Games. And here we go. So first, I thought it would be useful, because not everybody reads bios and stuff, to tell you a little bit about me. There's also a Q&A session afterwards, and one of the questions you guys had expressed interest in was how I came to be where I was. So I thought I would just stick it in the main talk, and then afterwards in the Q&A we can talk about other stuff. So I've been around in the game industry for a really long time, which means it was before there were any degree programs, and that means that my experience was very strange. I started immediately after college moving to New York City to direct theater, interactive theater of all things. And after doing a gallery show, I got my first job making games at an ad agency. So my path was very long and meandering. These are some really low-res screenshots of Kurt Master, the master agent who solves problems in a branching narrative with his master card that I won an award for, a one-show pencil award a long time ago. And I also did this You Don't Know Jack clone for IBM, internal usage only, that was teaching their sales staff how to identify a route to market. Anyway, my big break, though, came when a bunch of people in the agency world moved to Sesame Street Interactive. And so I got a job producing everything that was SesameStreet.com/games, which was a dream come true. It was wonderful. It's very rewarding. And then after doing some freelance work, I guess my next big break was I was hired by Breakaway Games in Hunt Valley, Maryland. A lot of the things that I worked on there never shipped. Some of them did ship, but nobody heard of them. And the things that shipped and people probably heard of are Battle for Middle-earth 2: Rise of the Witch King and Command & Conquer 3: Kane's Wrath. Those were both expansions. And then in 2008, when the economic downturn happened, I was laid off, and I decided that I was not going to take it lying down. I was going to pursue my dreams, which were work in action adventure. So I applied to all the companies that did that. And again, I was very lucky in that some of the things that I said in my job interview and some of the canceled projects at Breakaway were perfect for the Tomb Raider team. So I joined the Tomb Raider team at Crystal Dynamics in Northern California at the tail end of 2008, when we were still in concept phase for what became the Tomb Raider reboot. And then I stuck around there, was promoted to lead technical designer for Rise of the Tomb Raider when that started. And before that shipped, I think in 2004, I was wooed away by Amazon Game Studios, ended up in Southern California, didn't ship anything at Amazon Game Studios, and wound up working for Giant Sparrow, where I supported the team that made What Remains of Edith Finch. So that was amazingly rewarding. And then after that game shipped, and the team went down to basically just Ian Dallas, the owner, creative director, I got a gig at Ready at Dawn, which is where I am now. I'm a lead designer at Ready at Dawn. I worked a little bit on Lone Echo, but not as a lead designer. It was at the very tail end of the project. I joined the team and supported them for the last couple months. Near the tail end of last year, I was also supporting the team trying to port Echo VR to Quest, which is coming soon. Those are both VR games, for those of you who haven't heard of them. I cannot recommend them highly enough. Lone Echo is exclusive on the Oculus Rift right now, although I can confirm from personal experience it works with the Oculus Quest with the link cable. And I'm currently the lead designer of an unannounced project at Ready at Dawn that has a lot of job postings about it on our website. So it's a long and meandering thing, but I share that. I take the time to share that because I thought it'd be interesting to you guys to see how the path from point A to point B is not at all clear, and also because all of this life experience and job experience kind of influenced how I look at the main topic of this talk, which is puzzle design. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about what our goal is, like what is a puzzle, what are puzzles for, what's a puzzle. I like to look at things like a beginner. That was just something that Steve Jobs liked to say, and I agree that it helps when you look at things as a designer, as a beginner, because the audience or consumer player is going to be experiencing what you're designing for the first time. So what are puzzles? I'm going to talk a little bit about defining values for the puzzles that will be in your game. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to choose puzzle ingredients. I'm going to tell you what I mean by ingredients. It's a Ubisoft term that I like to use. I'm going to talk a little bit about puzzle pacing, a good puzzle development process, and then I'm going to sort of recap all that and do some Q&A. So let's start at the beginning. So what are puzzles for, especially in action adventure games, which is where my expertise is, and what even is a puzzle? So the name of this talk is from Skyfall, from Javier Bardem's character, who says, I used a slide like this in my 2013 talk at GDC about Tomb Raider. But I replaced Mr. Bond with Ms. Croft. Do you see what comes of all this running around, Ms. Croft? All this jumping and fighting. It's exhausting. So my talk is about what's between the jumping and fighting. So let's talk about Tomb Raider a little bit as a window into action adventure. So this sort of triangle thing is something that many of the games within the Square Enix Europe family of companies use. The tip of the spear, it's a sort of variant of the idea of game pillars that many companies use. I think it was Tim Longo, who was the first creative director I worked under at Crystal, who came up with this shape, and Noah Hughes uses it too. But the idea is that there's a tip of the spear, which defines what the player fantasy is, what the player, what you're inviting the player to experience. And then that's supported in most action adventures with combat, traversal, and puzzles. But those three elements have different flavors depending on what the tip of the spear is. So for the Tomb Raider reboots, especially the two that I worked on, and to an extent, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, that Heath Smith was the lead designer of, that's Square Enix Montreal, sort of continued that journey for Lara. The Square Enix Montreal team and the Crystal Dynamics team worked very closely together for all three games, and I love those guys. So we called the tip of the spear survival action, and the wording of the different supports varied a little bit during the development process and depending on how we're talking about them. But we talk about traversal as being fluid and dynamic. We talk about combat as being desperate and brutal. And we talk about the flavor of puzzles being that we want the player to be smart, resourceful Lara. The other way we look at it is sort of through the lens of what one of my mentors, Dan Besson, called rational game design process, which is what player fantasy are you offering to the player? So in survival action, we're offering the player the fantasy of going on a journey from being hunted to being a hunter. So she starts stranded on an island, pursued by enemies. She learns to use the environment as a hiding place and survive and grow stronger, get a bow, tools out of that environment, ultimately transforming the environment into her weapon and eventually becoming the ultimate hunter. Okay, so But Tomb Raider's not the only action adventure, right? It's in this broader genre that includes the work of, other companies. And if you sort of go abstract, there are some common components to it. In every case, we're offering the player an action adventure fantasy, which is hero's journey, and there's jumping, and there's fighting, and then there's this thing in the middle. And we know that the pleasure that you get out of the combat, right, is you get to feel aggressive, and traversal, you feel the flow of being agile. And nobody in real life is as capable in combat as Lara, or as agile in traversal. And so the puzzle fantasy, the one of having insight, is also a fantasy in a way. The puzzles let you feel smart. So on the hero's journey, you get to feel aggressive, you get to feel agile, you get to feel smart, and then the narrative context wrapping around it all makes all of that meaningful. And so that's why I was calling this talk Between Jumping and Fighting. There's experiencing insight, which is what puzzles are for. You want to be a good fighter, an agile mover, and an insightful problem solver. So this is a screenshot of an Excel document. So one of the things that I think you'll find many people do at Crystal Dynamics, Naughty Dog, Insomniac, Sucker Punch, Respawn, all the companies that play in this genre. God, now I feel like I'm going to offend people by omitting them. Also, Rocksteady, boy, with the Arkham games, I looked a lot at that game when I was working on the Tomb Raider reboot, so I'm embarrassed I forgot that. Anyway, but this is something that a lot of us do at these companies, where if there's a particular chapter or sequence of levels in a particular game that just feels right, we'll do a minute-by-minute breakdown. So this is sort of removed some of the identifying information from this. But this was during the development process of, I think, either Tomb Raider or Rise of the Tomb Raider. We did a beat-by-beat breakdown, minute-by-minute, not beat-by-beat, a breakdown of other action-adventure games. And if you sort of line all of these rows of colors up vertically, you can have a sense of, as a lead or a director, you can sort of have an overall sense of how much fighting there is, how much traversal there is, how many cinematics, how many puzzles. And so just looking at this, you can see that this 34-minute chapter of gameplay has a couple of minutes. It starts with a little combat moment, and then you're walking and talking, you're getting some narrative content while moving, and then there's like a 2-minute cinematic. And that's kind of one chunk, and then it goes green for a bit, so there's like a 4-minute chunk in there where mostly you're traversing, but there's a couple of enemies to kill. And then there's kind of another section of the movement where there's some pretty intense combat with a little cinematic in between. And then there's another cinematic, minute 17, 18, it's about 2 minutes long. And then there's this huge chunk relative to the overall chapter, like 6 whole minutes of puzzle. Which when you really do it minute by minute, you realize most combat encounters and traversal sequences, they're short. They're very short. And so why are we giving all of this time? What is the player getting out of this sort of 6 solid minutes of doing one activity? One of the things about action adventure having those components is you're constantly cycling between traversal, combat, and puzzles, and delivery of narrative, which may or may not be cinematic. There are many ways of delivering narrative content. So what is happening in that big chunk of time? So here's a working definition I'll throw at you, and then I will immediately challenge it. Let's say a puzzle is a mental challenge that has a clear goal, unclear execution steps, and an aha moment for the player to discover what to do. So we want them to have insight. So there should be a moment where they get to experience that insight, just like in a combat moment, they get to feel aggressive, or in a traversal moment, they get to feel agile. But, a lot of things that appear to be puzzles, or that you might identify as puzzles in action adventure games, are switches or they're dressed up switches. And we know that players will flip switches just because they're in front of them, even if, like in the old original Doom, you flip a switch, the lights go out, and a whole bunch of monsters spawn out of a closet. In Tomb Raider Underworld, immediately before Tomb Raider 2013, there were switches where you would traverse your way to a H pole, horizontal pole, and the players wait on that pole, or the act of attaching to that pole would trigger an event. And then I think this is Uncharted 2. I grabbed the screenshot some time ago. There's a puzzle of shining the light. But there's really, in that section, I love that game, don't get me wrong. I absolutely love that game. But that moment is less of a puzzle and more of a switch, because through playtesting and polish, there's really only one place where you can shine that mirror that's going to do anything. So it's effectively a switch. So you can dress up a simple switch in a whole bunch of different ways by putting a traversal challenge in the way, or a combat challenge, or observation, but there's still switches that the player is flipping just because they're there, and not exactly a moment of aha. So I want to differentiate then I'm going to use the word puzzle to refer to something that is solved. So same definition as before, but differentiated from a task that's completed. So a task is one where you give the player an execution challenge that is a clear goal and obvious execution steps. And of course, there's going to be a fuzzy boundary there, because no two people are going to agree about what's obvious and what is insight. But one thing we can agree on is that the execution steps in puzzles versus tasks use many of the same skills: player observation, deduction, timing, sequencing, precision. These are the skills that we can test as game designers in console action adventure games, and many other types of games as well. My assertion is it's that aha that makes the player feel smart and resourceful. They have an insight, and it makes them feel smart. And I think you can tell when a game is, when a particular beat is in that fuzzy boundary between what's clearly a task and what's clearly a puzzle. If you have more of an ah moment than an aha, if you're like, oh, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. It's closer to task. And I want to quote Randy Smith here. He gave a really excellent talk in 2009 that was pretty influential on me at GDC. One of the things he said was, the puzzles can make the player feel smart when they aren't making the player feel dumb. And tying it back to what our goals are in the action adventure genre, we don't want to be making the player feel dumb for very long. We want to give them that pleasure of feeling smart. Okay, so different games want different puzzles. So how do you go about deciding what kinds of puzzles are right for your game? Because there's a huge variety in what skills you could test with the puzzle. So I want to bring up the idea of declaring and defining puzzle value for your adventure game, or for your Metroidvania game, or for your first-person shooter, or for any game that has that same kind of flavor of combat, traversal, and puzzle. And three of the big questions are how challenging and rewarding you want the problem solving to be. So you should ask yourself that. Who's going to be playing, and what is obvious versus not obvious to them? So where is the boundary between a task and a puzzle and a trap to them? A trap being a task or a puzzle that then leads to bad things. And how do you want the player to learn? So I'm going to give some examples of answers to this question. So one reason I wanted to share these photos is when we were looking at transforming puzzles in the Tomb Raider reboot, I was very taken with, and so was the rest of the design team, with the aha moments in Half-Life 2, as opposed to what had previously been done in the Tomb Raider franchise. We really loved how in Half-Life 2 you had simple physics interactions like the teeter-totter puzzle, which you'll recognize we borrowed in Rise of the Tomb Raider. There is a side tune that has nearly this identical puzzle, except as a third-person puzzle. And there was much less focus in that particular game on operating giant machines with gears and pulling switches and jumping and trying not to die. And that was a conscious decision that we made. And as we went to Rise of the Tomb Raider and then Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the team has brought back more elements that rely more heavily on Lara's traversal abilities and less on these simple physics interactions. But Tomb Raider 2013 is the game I'm sort of mostly going to reference in this talk. So the idea of puzzle values came up for me in a design talk that Jeppe Carlsen gave. He was from Play Dead. I believe he gave it in. Let me look at my speaker notes here. I think it was either 2008 or 9. It's pretty early in the Tomb Raider process. I saw this at GDC, and I was like, yes. How are we different from this? So in one slide or two slides, I'm going to try to summarize what he said in this talk, but it's definitely worth looking up. So he had a series of 5 things, so rules of thumb for each room in Limbo, which remember it's a side-scrolling game, so it's a very different kind of game than Tomb Raider. But one of the rules was consider the player his enemy. So every puzzle should have devious tricks to kill the player surprisingly and brutally in Limbo. 2, consider the player my friend. So by that he meant he wanted to make environments clear and the interactions intuitive and really stand out from the environments. And especially he wanted to make sure the goal was clear. In a game like Limbo, it's much easier to make the goal clear than a game like Tomb Raider because the goal is often go to the right side of the screen. Whereas in a third-person game, you run the risk of the player being lost and not understanding which way is forward even. Third puzzle value was that puzzle designers in Limbo, or Jeppe himself, was going to anticipate or even encourage wrong solutions. So in looking at a given screen or space, he would ask himself what the player was likely to try first, and then anticipate that generally by making sure that whatever that first try was would kill the player surprisingly and brutally, so that they would learn, which was the way he wanted players to learn in that game. He wanted to make sure that once you did figure out what you were supposed to do, that was easy to execute, because if the right solution was difficult to execute, then players might conclude it was wrong, and then they would be stuck because the game taught them they were wrong by their own experience. And that meant for the last value that in Limbo, they made sure to polish the wrong strategies as much as the right strategies, meaning eliminate red herrings, eliminate near misses. So if there's nothing in that game, or he wanted there to be nothing in that game where it felt like you could almost make it pursuing a wrong solution, he wanted wrong solutions to be clearly wrong, and he wanted them to very clearly and quickly and brutally slaughter you to clearly communicate to the player, no, you haven't had your aha moment yet. Try something else. And so through these values, he came up with the idea of ideal puzzle play. So he wanted players to experiment and fail, learn by dying, analyze how they died and derive a new strategy for getting through the room, and then solve the problem. So I was sitting in the audience and I saw this and I'm like, wow, this is such a useful thing for looking at how we should approach like reinventing what a Tomb Raider puzzle is, because we want to reinvent each of the pillars for the Tomb Raider 2013. So how could I use this framework on Tomb Raider puzzles? And it turned out to be remarkably resilient to a complete change in type of game, style of game, setting, character control scheme, etc. But there were a couple of interesting differences that I thought was worth sharing. So experimentation is shared by Limbo and Tomb Raider and Half-Life 2. But we felt that since we were presenting a player fantasy of survival, learning by dying was inconsistent with the player fantasy. We wanted Lara to succeed by the skin of her teeth, or to barely make it, or to resiliently avoid death and try something else. And so it was important when we were designing puzzles to try not to kill the player, make puzzle spaces relatively safer than combat spaces and traversal spaces, unless there was a traversal challenge or something, or you really worked at it. So you'll find the opportunities for death, especially as you're learning what the mechanics are, less plentiful in Tomb Raider 2013 anyway, than in Limbo. And then the other thing that was different was there's this template, I think. Initially I was thinking maybe it was started by Raiders of the Lost Ark with the golden idol turning into the rolling ball, but it actually goes all the way to maybe Homer's Odyssey and Westerns and all sorts of things. And that is that in an action-adventure hero's journey, the reward for solving a problem is often more problems. So you go from this relatively quiet puzzle beat to an action-packed traversal sequence or combat sequence. And so we added an additional aspect to the Tomb Raider ideal play for puzzles, which is that your reward is, of course, a reward of some kind, but chaos. So there will always be an explosion or enemies spawning or both, or a traversal time pressure or something to really kick the game back into high gear and offer a high octane moment after the relative peace and that's something, honestly, the puzzles in God of War, I can't believe I left Santa Monica off my list earlier. God of War often did all the way back to the very first God of War game. You would have a moment of relative calm, and then your reward for solving the puzzle was fighting. So let's look a little bit about how that survived the transition. So both games talk about, or both ideal play scenarios, I guess, depend on the idea that within a puzzle space there are a few elements, but the Limbo player has only 3 tools, and I'm using tools in the Ubisoft sense. In their terminology, a tool is something that the player has that they can do to operate on the world that comes with them. So jumping is a tool as much as a gun is a tool because it applies damage. These are things that the player carries around with them from environment to environment. And an ingredient is a thing that is placed by a level designer, whether that's an object like an explosive barrel or an enemy. Those are things that level designers place, and that's sort of differentiated from tools in that terminology, the tools and ingredients terminology. So in Tomb Raider, the player has a lot of tools, not just jumping and many flavors of different ways to interact with the environment, but literal tools, the axe, the fire arrow, the bow, different kinds of guns, the axe's ability to pry. There's something like 8 different tools and at least 12 different guns plus gun upgrades, a rope arrow. And so if you're going to feel smart and resourceful with such a huge toolbox, Tomb Raider puzzles over the course of the game have to cycle through them so that you can feel that sense of, oh, let me try this, oh, let me try this, let me try this. And so that means that while there are many elements overall, each element that you can interact with in different ways with your different tools, we would put few of those elements in a single puzzle. So the other thing that I think I alluded to a little bit earlier is that environments are very different in a third-person game like Tomb Raider but they're also noisier. There's more distractions from what the puzzle elements are because of the realistic art style, and that's the heavier burden of visual language, which means that if you want the player to parse the environment and see it as simple, the ingredients that you can interact with your tools really have to stand out from the environment. And the third thing that is something that I guess Limbo and Tomb Raider and many games that have puzzles share is that you can't really repeat a puzzle, because in order to have an aha moment of insight, you need to encounter something new, and that makes puzzles a particularly expensive and non-repeatable unit of content. Because when you see something and it is exactly like what you did before, it's a chore. There can be some pleasure in recognizing things. The puzzles in the new God of War are very simple and offer sort of reuse a lot of the same ingredients. And so you do have this pleasure of like, oh, it's that thing. What do I do with that? I hit it with the axe. And so there's pleasure there. But you have to keep that simple to keep it as a cool, I recognize that, as opposed to a chore. And then the more things that you have, of course, because there's no repetition, you have to think about making sure that the different ingredients that you can operate on with your tools can be experimented on in different ways. And then a difference between Limbo and Metroidvania nonlinear games like God of War and Tomb Raider is that you have to be flexible about the sequencing of the puzzles, because with the exception of the gating puzzles in the main path, you aren't 100% sure in what order players are going to encounter the side content and the gates on the side content. So it was with that sort of sense of mastery of what made a good puzzle in action adventure games that I came to Ready It's On, and I immediately was like, hey team, let me take a look at the puzzles you guys made in Lone Echo and do comparison, and it taught me something. So I thought I would share that little bit of insight with you guys. And so, spoiler, just don't read this too closely if you haven't played Lone Echo yet. I sort of did a list of all the things that might be considered tasks and puzzles that involved puzzle ingredients within the main path. So this isn't an exhaustive list of all of those, because it's a nonlinear game with a hub and spoke structure, just like Tomb Raider. It fits in VR. So this isn't all of them, but these are all the ones in the main path that sort of appear to be puzzles. And you'll notice most of them don't have aha moments. So Liv tells you what to do, and you do it, or you work with her and you do it. And in fact, of the 4 ones that have sort of aha moments, the first 3, I put a little ah on them, because it's more of a when you're at dig site A and you're replacing the battery on the radiation scrubber, the moment you have is more of a, oh, I can return to the battery, and I can use that battery, or I could use the battery I brought with me. So it's not this big moment of insight like you would have in Portal, where you're like, oh my gosh, I just figured it out. Boom, solved. There's one of those close to the tail end of the game, the most sort of rewarding aha moment. And so initially what I was thinking was like, wow, it's really surprising that that so few of these moments that use these very rich puzzling ingredients, and the player in Lone Echo has a pretty rich set of tools. I was like, why don't we have more aha moments? And so I talked to the directors about it some more, and also using this idea of creating a yardstick of what your ideal play is. It revealed something not only about that game, but also about the whole Lone Echo franchise, which is the bond between the player and Liv is very much what those games are about. And so whereas in the case of, just going to back up for a second, experimenting and failing is a component of ideal puzzle play in Limbo. in Lone Echo, what counts, what's important, is the idea of experimenting together and bonding with Liv, because it's a game about their relationship. Also, what's different about both Limbo and Tomb Raider is that in Lone Echo, dying can be helpful. You have this radiation resistance bar, which if it runs out, you're a robot. I'm sorry for those of you who haven't played, but you're a robot, and you can sort of see yourself deteriorating as you're exposed to more and more radiation. And if you die and the 3D printer prints a new you instantly, your radiation resistance is full. And so it's not a bad thing to die. So we don't have to worry about avoiding death in doing a task or puzzle. But the third thing turns out to be all-encompassing and very important, which is the cognitive load in VR is incredibly high. It's high because you've got this heavy, unfamiliar object on your face. You're in an unfamiliar world. Some people get greater or lesser fatigue being in VR. Time feels like it moves more slowly in VR. It's tiring. And our movement model is zero gravity, which we've been praised for. But at the same time, you can't sort of rely on sort of sitting still and thinking about how to solve a puzzle. If you touch something, you might slowly drift. And so it's tiring. And the directors at Ready at Dawn were very aware of that. So it was a very conscious decision to make sure that all of those moments were closer to tasks and less like puzzles, to minimize the cognitive load on the player so that they could be immersed. Because if you are under a lot of cognitive load, it's going to pull you out of the experience, and then that's going to interfere with your ability to bond with Liv. And so it wasn't necessarily about solving problems as much as it was completing the task and getting the fulfillment from ticking the box and finishing the task. And I bring that up at great length because I think it would be easy to interpret sort of my sort of differentiating puzzles from tasks by saying, oh, puzzles are better than tasks. But in this case, and in many games cases, tasks are better than puzzles. And it's very important to understand exactly what it is you're trying to make the player feel, so that you can choose the right goals, so that you can choose the right tools and ingredients and mechanics. Okay, so moving on. Wow, I am going slower because I don't have an audience nodding and saying things are going great. So, all right, so I'm gonna move forward. So the next section I want to talk about is how to choose good ingredients. And for this, I'm going to borrow a lot from Randy and Harvey Smith, formerly of Irrational and Iron Storm, Deus Ex. Harvey Smith then went on to work at Arcane on Dishonored, so you may know that name. These are people who greatly inspired me, who I met very early in my career. So the important thing to note from what I was saying before is that these ingredients you put in your levels for both puzzle and task, they look the same and they have the same affordances, by which I mean it's an object, it's a key. What do? You insert it into a lock, flip switch, push crate, enter combination, scan object, like this. Right? These are the same ingredients. Players get to aha when those ingredients give them an opportunity to experiment and play with their tools. What the player has, which you've probably built for traversal and combat, those are the things that are going to operate on the puzzle ingredients. And it's going to feel more like experimentation when patterns emerge from the interactions between those ingredients and tools in the environment. So, for example, as surprising as this would sound, in previous Tomb Raider games, the way you would do sort of a pressure plate with Lara is there would be a trigger volume and Lara would enter it. She didn't actually have any weight. So jumping up and down on a thing, which seems intuitive, didn't actually do anything unless it was scripted to do that. On Tomb Raider 2013, we changed that so that the player could be on objects attached to pulleys and teeter-totters and could jump up and down on them or could leap on them from a height and get a response out of them that was intuitive to people who are familiar with physics in the real world. And when you have the ability to experiment with the tools and the ingredients, you have that moment of aha, which is the most rewarding moment in a puzzle beat, in that big chunk of green rectangles of a puzzle beat. And so since you want emergence, I want to point you to a GDC 2004 talk about how to get emergence. This is a design pattern I've used again and again and again in my career, and I like to share it every time I have the opportunity, and give credit to Randy and Harvey for making this beautiful chart. So in many games, the interactions between the tools that you have at the left, say, and the ingredients that are in the levels are scripted. And what they have been doing in the immersive sim genre that we implemented on Tomb Raider is to create this abstraction layer in between that they call stims. So arrows don't actually hurt guards. Arrows produce pierced stim, and guards, when they receive pierced stim, take damage. And this leads to emergence because the player doesn't need to predict every possible, the designer doesn't need to predict every possible combination of ingredient to ingredient interaction. All they have to do is say, this tool produces these stims, and these ingredients react in the following ways to the relatively short list of all possible stims in the game. So the fire arrow produces pierce stim and fire stim. The oil puddle says, oh, well, I don't respond to pierce stim. Maybe I go sploosh. There's an effect if you shoot a regular arrow at me, so the player knows that the game hurt him or her. But when it receives fire stim, it ignites. And then it produces fire stim, and then anything else that receives that might do something. So, which brings me to my next point, which is that it's when you're designing for emergence, you want ingredients to be able to talk to each other. So, and for each connection that you have, you get this sort of ever-increasing web of interactions. This was also from Randy and Harvey Smith's talk. So, the point being, if you remove one interaction, which is weapons fire bullets when dropped, you eliminate this whole delicious set of interactions, and you can no longer tell a story that I shot an enemy, he dropped his weapon, weapons fire bullets when dropped, bullets rupture barrels, gas barrels leak poison, poison kills enemy, and you lose that beautiful emergence. So it's important to have this stim system or some other system that lets ingredients talk to each other. And then from the perspective of designing puzzles, it helps players feel smart, as I mentioned, when they can use their intuition to predict what experiments will reveal how the network of connections works. So you can draw ideas from real life, like mass, pulleys, buoyancy, and fire, and stuff. So this is one of the reasons why I looked so much at Half-Life 2 when we were looking at Tomb Raider. But it also helps if you can't have all of the ingredients, invest in the ones that use related mechanics. So if you've already got a fire arrow that can light enemies on fire, and burning enemies can hurt other enemies, and you've built that for the combat pillar, then add more ingredients that are related to fire. So, right, oil puddles and lanterns and flares and molotovs and Lara's torch and the lantern she throws that light things on fire, and explosive barrels and rolling dynamite cars, not just dynamite, or a truck you can drive that blows up and lights things on fire. But also, lest you think I'm a pyro maniac, also invest in ingredients that put out or prevent fires. So fire extinguishers and water balloons and gates that you can open that release torrents of water, or doors that vent oxygen into space. So you've built this network of things that affect each other. And you can, if you can afford it, you can build multiple networks. I'm thinking of BioShock, where they had the electricity water loop and the water fire loop, and they were sort of overlapping. but not completely overlapping. And in a situation like that, you want to be aware of, I think one criticism you can level fairly at Tomb Raider is that there was so much investment in sort of fire that some of the other elements related to force or wind didn't feel quite as robust or as interesting. Next big topic. So now that you've got all these ingredients, and I know that I'm running late, but I'm doing a Q&A session. Oh yeah, I'm doing a Q&A session later, so I'm not too worried about running a little over. And so stop me, organizers, if you guys are. I'm definitely going slower. So Kirby, you're failing me. You should be urging me to hurry up. I'm gonna share some really awesome insights about pacing that I think you'll find really useful. So there's a lot of text on the slide, so I'm going to summarize it, and you can look at it in the slides. I don't know how big your screen is that you're watching this on. But puzzles have definite sort of phases, both before and after the aha moment I keep talking about. And I've got a little diagram of sort of the emotions, the sort of emotional engagement that you have during them. So first, there's this moment of identifying your goal. You're in a puzzle space. You're like, wow, all right, I'm in a puzzle. Where am I supposed to go, and what's in my way? And there's this moment of novelty, and the longer that goes on, the more it sort of starts to fade. The longer it takes to identify the goal, the more boring that beat is going to get. Then you're like, okay, this space has things in it. What does this do? What does that do? Oh, there's another thing. And are there more things? Do they interact with each other? What can I do? And so every moment of discovery the player has is going to produce a little jolt of dopamine and a little small peak of fun, but you can't let it drag on too long. And while you're sort of discovering and experimenting these, if as a designer you can design in a wait a minute moment where their first idea hits a snag, that is ideal. You see this a lot, interestingly, in crossword puzzle design, where near the top they'll give you a clue and you'll think you know the answer, and as you fill it in, you'll realize that the letters of the first few clues don't fit, and you have this wait a minute moment, and then you have an aha moment where you're like, oh, it's actually a different word of the same length, and the letters are different, and then that helps me solve the puzzle. And that's the aha moment. That is always the climax of the puzzle, the highest peak of fun, where you're like, I know what to do, and it's not the same as solving the puzzle. It's when the player knows and is certain how to solve it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that difference. So it's distinct, right, from actually executing the solution. The aha moment is when you're like, oh, I know what to do, and then you have to do it. And those execution steps, as I mentioned above, will involve timing, sequencing, precision, maybe a traversal challenge. But it's important to note the longer execution drags on after your aha, the more of a drag the puzzle is going to be, because they already had their fun. The fun was in the aha moment, which sort of leads me to the sort of reward and exit. So after they've executed it, there'll be something they get for solving the puzzle. If it's a gating puzzle, that might just be to open the gate and now they can proceed, or it might be something that you get. But you'll notice in Tomb Raider puzzles, there's very, very often a zip line that takes you from the ending to the exit. Or in a lot of the Assassin's Creed spaces, and I'm thinking of like Assassin's Creed 2 and 3 and 4, you'll get to the reward and then, oh, the door is right there and you'll exit. There's a reason for that, which is at this point, after you've had your moment of fun and you've proven you can execute it, the player just wants to move on to the next thing. So you need to keep your exits as short as possible. And so this means that even if you have great puzzle values and great puzzle ingredients, the way you structure the experience, the pacing of the experience can affect what people think of that element in your game. So in an ideal puzzle, you have a short phase of identifying the goal. They know what to do. They find all the ingredients. You have a long phase of discovering and experimenting with the ingredients. you have your little spike of aha, a relatively short execution, and a rapid exit. And then they go, that was fun. But you're going to see some common patterns in player feedback if those proportions shift. So I thought I would share some of it. When I noticed this, it was incredibly interesting. So what if it takes too long to execute? They had their moment of insight. They're like, yes, I know what to do. And then they have to execute, right? They're going to say, wow, that was boring. Because they had their fun. They had their fun well before the midpoint of the puzzle. What if instead you have this long period at the front where they're not sure what to do, they're not sure where to go, they haven't found all the ingredients. Maybe one of the ingredients was in a crate and you were expecting them to open the crate first before they could even see that there was a stick that they could light on fire to burn the barrier, and they didn't think to destroy the crate until they got frustrated. That person is going to say it's confusing. And if you literally look at the gameplay minutes of a playtest, if you see a big chunk of time before they start to discover an experiment, they're going to say that was confusing or that was frustrating. What about a long exit? So you solved the puzzle, you did a great puzzle, short execution, you think you're ready to go, and then you have this long way to actually get to the next part of the game, or you have to retraverse all the way back through what the player has already seen and already gotten the novelty from to get to the exit. They're going to say that was a waste of time. Why did they go all the way here and solve that thing only to traverse all the way back? And I'm getting a little notification, okay, I am fine. Back to my screen. Oh no, I messed it up. And then down Alt Tab. There we go. Okay. Okay. Sorry, it's so new here. Anyway, all right. So this is like, I think these images are from Yepid's talk. It's from a Prince of Persia puzzle. And the advice that he gave, if you're trying to make a more difficult puzzle, don't add execution steps. So there's a common idea of like, okay, well, if an easy puzzle is like 1 step or 2 steps, then a hard puzzle is 10 steps. But if you add more execution steps, you add boredom. A person faced with this puzzle is eventually going to just start turning switches at random. Instead of having a moment of insight, they're just going to brute force their way through it just to escape. So don't add execution steps to ramp up difficulty. And then overall, don't hide the goal. As I talked about, don't hide the ingredients. But do add more experimentation. Add more aha moments. Add wait a minute moments where you think that the stick was meant to be lit on fire, but actually it was meant to be stuck into a gear or a doorway. So do you have an aha moment of an ingredient that you thought was used in one way, but is actually used in another way? All right. Which leads me to my last topic, which is sort of the process of getting this done at a AAA studio, which 1, 2, 3, 4, a handful of slides that I think will be useful to you. So I'll probably rush through the recap just to give these time. And thank you for sticking with me. Without your feedback, I'm like seeing your faces and voices, I'm like probably going a little slowly, thinking that you're not with me, but you probably are. So, all right, we talk a little bit about like 2 parts of the process that I think would be useful for you to see. So one of them is pre-production, and this one I got lucky because I found a YouTube video you're not going to believe. So one of the things that I advise in pre-production, when you're trying to figure out what your ingredients are, what your puzzles are, what your values are, how things are going to work, is to make what I call a puzzle ramp. That this was a thing that we did at Crystal. So you build a series of small cube-like rooms. They're kind of like the Unreal samples levels, honestly. But each room contains just one or two simple out-of-context interactions, ascending from most simple to most complex. And my recommendation is that you play test this entire ramp with playtesters and observe them and iterate on them. And tissue testing, where you get different testers in, is ideal for this. The goal here is to have them play each room and not to use them all in your game, but to find combinations of things that are a highlight. And because you've sequenced them from simple to most complex, you can handpick rooms that work and build puzzles around them, which is what we did. And then you can skip rooms if, like, room 3 isn't very interesting or doesn't have a sufficiently distinct aha moment from room 2. You just don't do that in your game. So you might have room 1, room 2, and room 5 in your game. And then as you get to the mid and late game and you understand your ingredients better, then you'll be able to sort of mix and match and repeat them from across different ramps. So I'll give you an example. So we would make a sort of fire water ramp. So room 1 might be I light a torch from a hanging sconce and ignite a barrier, which was in that first level of Tomb Raider in the scavenger den. And then the next room introduces a fuse. So you light a torch, light a cloth, and the cloth propagates it to a barrier, and the barrier has been placed high up where you can't reach the ledge until it's been burned away or something. So you have to use the fuse. And then you have room 3, you introduce a waterfall. So you light a torch, but you go through a waterfall, and the waterfall puts it out. So as you can see, you're introducing these little elements, and then you put them in front of a play tester, and then without any context or any story or any traversal or combat beats in between them, you get a sense from the play tester about which ones were cool and which ones were not. And you can insert and remove rooms very rapidly if you do this sort of thing. I thought that no one would ever see these, but I recently discovered, and he's probably going to get all these subscribers now, a guy on YouTube hacked the Rise of the Tomb Raider archive and found that we apparently accidentally shipped all of these, but they're inaccessible. But they're there, and this guy on YouTube posted videos of a bunch of them. So this is an example of a puzzle ramp for the rope tether, and you can see it's like full of stuff that was not used, and but I would definitely look this up. The guy's name is Ghostblade, and this is what we did for all the world to see. So thank you, Ghostblade, for finding this and figuring out how to hack it. Okay. But since I didn't know until recently that existed, I wanted to share like this sort of a planning tool that we would do for the different ramps. And so because there's different kinds of ramps, I mentioned the one related to fire, and the one that you just saw is related to tethers. We'd have like one for things related to pulleys, and we would sort of think about what elements of that were early game, what were middle, and what were end. And with this sort of planning tool, we would sort of make decisions about which interactions would require sort of a big mental leap and a more difficult aha, and therefore belong later in the game, versus which things were simple interactions that would be obvious to the player, and then that meant that we would use them early in the game when we want sort of more obvious aha moments. We also use the tool called a rational level design document. And I'm going to go through this quickly because you'll have the slides. You can see this sort of thing. This is an Excel document. A lot of studios that make action adventures do this sort of thing. And the columns are each beat in each level. And then the rows are the different tools and when they're introduced to the player, and the different ingredients and when they're introduced to the player. So obviously you want a tool. You can see from this, if we're introducing jump in level 1 beat 2, that's tool A. Then ingredient 1, which is also introduced in level 1 beat 2, is probably related to something the player can jump on. And over the course of the game, you want to make sure to introduce a tool, have the player play with it, not necessarily in a puzzle environment. Then test their skill. That's what the yellow in level 1 beat 4 is. You want to test their skill at jumping, and then you want to challenge and have them ultimately master that tool. You aren't going to necessarily do that with every tool or every ingredient, but having a planning tool like this that sort of lets you see that you're sequencing and introducing the simple, like 1 or 2 interaction tools, and then the more complicated tools later. It's very, very useful for planning your the introduction of your tools and ingredients. So we call it a rational level design document. There may be other terms that other studios use, but it's invaluable. And it also lets you see holes in your pacing, and it also lets you see where you're missing opportunities to test or challenge an ingredient or reuse an ingredient that you've forgotten about. Something that often will happen is you'll introduce and test and master something like the rope arrow, and the players will forget about it because designers forgot to use it throughout the game. And a tool like this is really helpful for that. All right, next topic is that was pre-production. When you get to production, how do you build these spaces? Because they consume a whole ton of time. And I'm not going to go through all of these steps. They're very similar to any level design for any pillar of an action-adventure game. But I did want to talk to you guys about the puzzle brief. And I won't read all this, but there are sort of key components when you're working on a puzzle beat that it's really useful for either the team to think about if you're doing an indie project, or for a lead to think about providing the team, or for the leads in the team to work together on. But it's related to that rational level design document. Do you know that what you guys are working on for this particular moment of the game, are those initial parameters right in the context of the whole game, so that what the level designers are designing here in this moment with these tools, in this location with this pacing, is it the right puzzle? And so we would have a document template like this that would have teams pitch the context, what the goal is, what the spectacle moment is, because I mentioned that was part of our values, what unique ingredients were going to need to be made, and then what previously used ingredients we could use. And then that could be judged again against the yardsticks that we would share from beat to beat to beat to beat. So the process of sort of collaborating with the whole team and deciding, is this right for here and now? We wouldn't have to reinvent how to measure that every time. We could say, is this in scope? Is the goal clear? Does it use the ramping that we discovered work in the puzzle ramps? Is it appropriately complex, and does it use the tools and ingredients that the player is supposed to have at this point? And of course, exceptions are made all the time because chaos is what happens in game development, but at least you had a yardstick for that. And so for each one of these phases, we would have we'd have a set of goals that were clear, that everybody could share and work against. So are you designing the right puzzle at the right location? And when you're blocking it out, we get it functional without cheating, so that we can evaluate the context and readability and pacing. Can we get it ready for external play testing, so that you don't have to have anybody explaining the puzzle to people? They can just play it and you can get good feedback. Then when you get external play test feedback, have you made a decision about what to do about that? Are you going to go back to one of the previous phases and move forward? And then the reason I included this in this section is the big bit of advice I wanted to offer was do a little bit of polish at this point, but then put it in the can, to use a film term, lock the puzzle and move on, because puzzles will consume infinite time, and then you'll run out of time for working on the rest of your game. You will have time to polish the game at the end if you move on and finish the game. Two more things to mention. One is that puzzles change size. So there was a particular puzzle in Tomb Raider called Temple of the Handmaidens that started out as this enormous space with this huge circular river, and it took forever, and it broke the rule of fast resets, and it kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller and getting recontextualized from a cave with an island to basically this like little thing with a buoy that went around in an eddy in a sea cave. And the lesson from that is, if you can plan for it, because we built these spaces to have gates and streaming hallways around them, and if you guys do that as well when you make action adventure games, you can make the game smaller, or the room smaller or bigger, and reattach the streaming hallways to it. And it's very important that you plan for it, because I guarantee that it will happen. These spaces take a lot of iteration and change a lot more than traversal spaces or combat spaces. And the last thing that I wanted to introduce was the idea of what we call puzzle nuggets. So here's the problem. Let's say that you've got this puzzle room after combat and before a traversal sequence, and it uses these ingredients that they've mastered, like a flammable gas pocket. We use those in Tomb Raider, but the player's forgotten all about it. So we created these things that we call puzzle nuggets, that were their function was basically to jog the player's memory. And sometimes you might even need two of them. So to use a specific example, you've got this puzzle room with gas vents and fire arrows and flammable fuses and flammable sconces attached to pulleys. And you play test it, and they're like, they don't remember that an hour ago they did a sequence where gas pockets were lit on fire with the fire arrow. So a solution that we came up with is we added a gate and a little tiny room where a gas vent blocked the hallway, and you ignite it with fire arrow to progress to the main puzzle room. It's not even a puzzle, it's a nugget, because it's just a reminder, hey, you have this tool, it works on this ingredient, keep that in your mind, and then you've kind of primed their brains for the aha moment. Okay, so in typical fashion, if you see the GDC Vault of my 2013 talk, I went over time, but we had Q&A time. So I'm going to gloss over the recap so you have time for questions. But and I'm so embarrassed that every time I give talks, I seem to run out of time. But I had a lot of content I really wanted to give you. So I talked about several things today. I talked about what goals are for puzzles and how they fit in between jumping and fighting in the action adventure genre. And that tasks and puzzles are very similar. They use the same tools and ingredients, but in a task, the execution steps are obvious. And in a puzzle, the pleasure comes from this aha moment where the execution steps are unclear, but the goal is clear. And the aha moment is when the player discovers that they're certain about what they have to do, and they just have to do it. I talked about how you should come up with values for your puzzles and decide what the ideal puzzle should play like in your game, and how it supports the traversal and combat puzzles. And I want to highlight again, there's nothing wrong with plentiful tasks in your games, especially under the cognitive load of being in VR. They're very satisfying, and you have satisfying moments of getting things done. They're just different. I talked a little bit about how to create an emergence and how to select ingredients for your puzzles and design for them, and recommend you invest in related mechanics so you have more rewarding aha moments. And I used a little network from Randy and Harden's talk on Emergence. I talked about puzzle pacing and how maybe different from your game, but like we did, you're going to discover patterns in player feedback that map to pacing and how long each of these moments of a puzzle beat take. Some are too long or too short. You will hear the same feedback over and over again. And that should help you. This should help you anticipate what that feedback might be and what you can do about it. I talked about the process in pre-production of building ramps and in production of making sure that you do sufficient planning to have goals for the level designers, make sure you're using the right ingredients at the right time, polish and move on, very important. Planning for puzzle spaces changing size dramatically. It's not a failure if they do. It's going to happen, and so you might as well plan for it. And players are going to forget how to even use the things in your puzzle rooms to use nuggets. And with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this with you. I wish I could have been there in person. I was really excited to go see Kentucky, and I'm really bummed that I don't get to. So thanks very much. Anybody have any questions about the talk or any of the question topics that you guys had?
Hello, I'm gonna kind of follow up with questions and things. Thanks so much for being here. This is such a great talk with lots of, I think, valuable information. I'm gonna go back and watch the recording and pause and see all the nuggets there of great stuff. Yeah, and hopefully, maybe next year or whenever you could come to actual Kentucky and be in person. So it was great to have you here virtually, at least.
Yeah, I'm sorry I ran long. Like Kirby did not tell me that I was going too slow. So.
It's okay. I think everybody was really enjoying it. So we did have that one question. Let's see. It kind of was related. I think you've answered some of it, but when you're looking at approaching designing a puzzle game system, even on paper, how can you go about defining the tools and abilities a player has to create that web that you talked about? Yeah,
I mean, so I think it's on the things that I've worked on. Often, like the traversal and combat pillars are more important. I remember. So I was team on the Tomb Raider 2013 game. I was team captain of multiple pods or teams, and all of them had to do with upgrade systems and puzzle mechanics and that sort of thing. And because there was a really heavy lift for core combat, and I was working on combat upgrades, I was like, I need resources. And our executive producer at one point said something that I carry with me to this day, which is you can't have secondary systems until you have systems, which made me feel a lot better. So I guess my answer to that question would be start with the pillars that are why you think people are buying the game in the first place. Because the puzzle moments for the kinds of games I'm talking about are pace breakers and palate cleansers. So you start with those and see what's essential. Talk about Jedi Fallen Order, for example. Right? Clearly, lightsaber combat is important in that game. That's why people are buying that game. Then when it comes to designing the puzzle ingredients and those moments of the game, I would imagine they said, okay, given these force powers that we have and these lightsaber and the combat that we're building and the traversal that we're building, what can we do with them? And then you start to use the idea of emergence and say, what else could we do with these tools and ingredients? And what new ingredients could use these tools? Yeah, so that would be my approach typically. Unless you're designing a game all about puzzles, and that isn't, you should talk to Kim Swift about that.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm gonna kind of talk about some of these other things. So while Jonathan was here, I think he has a great perspective on, working with AAA and indies, and we kind of wanted to dive in a little bit of that. So had a little more time here with him. So I think one of the interesting things from your talk was that, seeing this different language that each of these studios have about the design and terminology and things. Is that like a common thing, or is that, trying to standardize, do you think, in the industry, or is it just
I mean, so my experience, because there were no schools, right, my experience is that every studio had their own language, and then as employees moved from studio to studio or got poached or left and were hired by studios doing the same thing, the language spread a little. but I mean, just look at how difficult it is in this discipline of level design to get people to decide if it's called gray boxing, white boxing, block out, block mesh, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very simple use case.
Yeah.
So I think my experience is that people will know what you're talking about because there's some of the same ideas, but there isn't really a common terminology. I'm quite taken with Ubisoft's terminology because I've never worked there, and it's probably too late for me to work there. It's very sad, unless it's too late. It's too late, and I love Ready It's On. So, but they apparently have a very rigorous onboarding process where people learn their terminology, and they have like a little mini design school. And I've had multiple collaborators and mentors who came out of there, which is why I use their some of their terms, tools, ingredients, rational level design, rational game design. Those are Ubisoft terms.
Cool.
And I like them.
Yeah. So Mile Mojo asks, have you worked on like massively multiplayer puzzles, like alternative reality games or massive community puzzles, where they're sort of deliberately obscure?
I've not, and I would be interested to learn myself, like whether these techniques or like to what extent these techniques are useful. I think that like one of the things I was trying to do was go from the specific to the abstract, so that I think design tools become more widely applicable the more abstract they are. So I'm pretty sure that there are some insights there for massive collaborative games, and that intrigues me. But I think history teaches us that people are the wisdom of the crowd, as it were, is very powerful. Those things will get solved very quickly once you put multiple brains on things. Yeah.
So maybe we can go back to a little bit of kind of maybe some of your history. So I guess one question is, how do you think working at a AAA studio compares to working at an indie studio? You kind of had time at both of those things, and what do you think the differences are?
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting also because as our fearless leader at Ready at Dawn, Rue, is fond of pointing out, we are an indie studio.
Yeah.
Insomniac was indie, but they were acquired recently, and Ready at Dawn is still indie. We're just big.
Yeah.
We're big indie. So I've been at two biggish third-party studios, and I've been at like enormous first-party studios, and I've been at a little small, scrappy, and wonderful place. I think chiefly the difference is all the processes that are effective, I think, are the same, especially in design. Listening is possibly the most important skill you can have, listening to your game, listening to your collaborators, listening to your audience. That doesn't change, and the tools don't change. The pipeline to yes changes a little bit because the bigger companies are often they're spending larger quantities of money and just to pay everybody's salary and keep the lights on, and that creates a certain responsibility, fiduciary responsibility, to spend that money well. And so I think it's more the pipeline to yes is a little to yes to trying something is a little bit more difficult the bigger they get, whether they're big indie or big corporate, because they have responsibility to spend money appropriately. So that's the pipeline to yes. It's I feel like this example would be sort of instructive. So, and this is a story I've told before, so I feel comfortable sharing this. And it worked out okay in the end. So, Crystal was owned by one publicly traded company, Eidos, and then it was bought by Square Enix while I was there. So I saw that sort of transition. I remember in my job interview, one of the things that I said was that, and I'm not claiming that I was the only person on the team who had this thought. My immediate boss, Jason Bada, agreed with me. So this is why it happened. But he didn't tell me that he was thinking that in my job interview. So in my job interview, I said that I thought I wanted to bring RPG mechanics into the franchise because if you want players to care about a player's journey, you should give them choice in the player's journey. And so very early in pre-production, I was like, I want to do a prototype of buying a skill. Like it's not that revolutionary. It's a thing that many games have done. RPG games have definitely done them, but I want to do a prototype of it. And so most games, pretty uncontroversial. You kill a thing, you get XP, you use the XP to buy a skill. And so I was thinking like, all right, we want to have this brutal visceral combat. I'm going to borrow from God of War. So I made this prototype where she kills an enemy and these little red spheres fall out of the enemy and kind of bounce around the ground like Lego studs in the Lego Star Wars type games. They bounce around and maybe go over a cliff, but it's fine because after a few seconds their physics turns off and then they zoom into the player, kind of like Rage from the God of War games. And then there's a little thing in the corner, and you get and then you go into a debug menu and you can buy a new skill, more health or whatever. It's a pretty straightforward prototype. And I played that at a team meeting, and there was a lot of dead silence among some of the people there, and they were like, it's so gamey and there's so much UI and I can't believe you wasted time working on this. And it was not a lot of time, as you can tell from the scope of it, but it almost completely killed that feature for months until the time was right, and I had sort of learned a little bit. I had learned a little bit more about how to get to the pipeline to yes, and present things in a way where people would listen to me. And then the result is, of course, it has lasted three games. Are now have borrowed that idea to give the player some choice in how she goes. So, but yeah, it's the pipeline to yes is more complicated. It's the bigger the company and the more money that they're spending.
And I guess maybe does that speak sort of with the culture and trust among the team, and how important is sort of that culture, with the design team, and how does that impact the development?
So trust is essential. I think it's important to point out that I was also new, so I hadn't earned trust yet. Right. So trust is vital everywhere. So I don't think the more people there are, the more people you have to be concerned about earning sort of having the sort of trust equation be net positive for every interaction you have. I think you have to be a lot more careful about not thinking before you act when there's more people, in the same way that if you go into a public park, you have to think more before you act than when you're in your living room.
Right.
I think that's the main difference. Is they're just different. It's just different it's different scales. And one you have to be a little bit more careful. But that doesn't mean that I like it. This doesn't mean it's better or worse.
Yeah, great. Let's see, Mild Mojo had another question about, so lots of games have similar sets of physical processes, as puzzle ingredients like fire, weight, light. So in your opinion, what are some more novel ingredients and systems that you've either created or that you've studied?
Wow, that's really hard. Yeah. Yeah, novel is hard because then players have to figure it out. I mean, I mentioned Kim Swift because, like all of us in this industry, and I mean, she would be the first to admit it was the whole team, of course, but Portal was amazing in that the idea of the blue portal and the orange portal, it's that's more novel, and that whole game had amazing ramp of puzzle ingredients. It didn't have combat other than figuring out how to create a portal underneath the turrets that you could destroy them. But there was no direct combat tools that the player had. That's certainly more novel. It's not a very good answer, but if you haven't played Portal, and especially Portal, the end of Portal 2 is possibly one of the best endings in video games, in my opinion. So, because they managed to guarantee a super rewarding aha moment for every player, where everyone's mind is blown, where they're like, "Oh my God, I'm supposed to do that!" It's glorious. So,
you played Half-Life Alyx?
So I'm going to go play Half-Life Alyx. I am.
Okay. I haven't either, so we don't want to spoil anything, but I heard the ending is really great in that as well. So
yeah, so I have I recently packed away my Oculus Rift. I'm using now exclusively my Oculus Quest with the link cable for VR now, and it's amazing. But my home built PC seems to lock up more frequently when playing VR with the link cable, which in fairness is in beta. Yeah. So I've had a number of nights where I'm like, I'm gonna finish Alyx, and then I don't.
Let's see. So I guess maybe kind of looking back, what do you think are some of the most important factors for a successful project or team?
Wow. I mean, I feel like I want to I guess quote Ian Dallas a little bit. Ian talked, when he talked about Edith Finch, about it being a series of prototypes, and he has talked publicly about how, this is before I joined the team, but early he was pitching the game as sort of a scuba diving simulator, which is interesting because I also worked on a scuba diving simulator that didn't ship. So that seems to be a thing that publishers find that then get canceled, unless you bootstrap them yourself like Subnautica, I guess. Wonderful. But the reason I bring that up is like what made that project successful in the end, despite the fact that it did take a really long time and there was a lot of iteration, but what made it successful was Ian's desire to get stuff working, evaluate it, and listen to what teammates are saying, what collaborators are saying, what the game is saying, what playtesters are saying. That for me, I cannot highlight enough how important that is, which is weird because I just gave a talk that lasted more than an hour, although it did start late, but in which I talked. But like, I feel like so many of the so many of the ideas that we bring to what we think we're going to make and how we think we're going to make them ultimately sort of don't exactly work, and that's partially because um, our medium has to be about constant innovation. Like there was a really wonderful radio lab about Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, where they talked about how Rite of Spring was completely was so innovative as to be offensive that it caused a riot when it was first played in Paris. Although the historical accuracy of that has been questioned, it definitely caused a big stir. And then within a few decades, it was in Fantasia for kids, because we crave what's new as humans, and then we go, and we figure it out, and we're like, that's cool. And then we're like, I've seen that before. And our medium is all about creating that feeling over and over and over again. And so all of the sort of theorizing and theory crafting and academic approaches are good for trying to prevent repeating the mistakes of the past, and that's why I shared a lot of that stuff. But when you're facing a new context, you have to listen to the game and what people are experiencing when playing it more than relying on what's happened before.
And you kind of talked about that with, throughout your talk. It's that play testing seems like so important, and getting that listening to people and that cycle of process of really listening to what's working from the players as well as sort of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why I tried to hit that point hard about puzzles. When you're working on a big project with a whole sequence of them, lock it, put it in the can, move on, because you really, you can work on every sort of small postage stamp size part of your game forever, but you're also going to want to learn about the overall experience. The thing that you over polish might be something that you end up cutting completely. There are levels, there are whole levels that I've seen cut that had worked on and something that were cut for good reasons. They're good, but they no longer fit. And then you're only going to get there once you have the sort of whole experience kind of vaguely there.
I guess maybe again, going back to your career, do you have any particular setbacks or failures that you've experienced that maybe have provided really valuable lessons learned that you could share?
Yeah, I like that RPG thing. was a great.
Yeah.
I think. I sort of feel like this is hard to talk about, because I'm very thankful to all of the experiences I've had and all the people who gave me those opportunities. I've been incredibly lucky in my career, and I've crunched so hard that I've missed years of my children's lives also. But the hard work and luck and preparation, all of it. But this is hard to talk about, but I feel like leaving Crystal was a strange setback, in that I wanted to do something new. I didn't want to do what I had been doing, but I was frightened that I would I'd never make a game as good as that again, as the Tomb Raider game. And I thought, well, gee, all this money that Amazon is offering me will be the solution to all my problems. And it was a really bad fit for me. And then when I left there, I was like, well, that's it. My career is over completely. I won't earn money or work on amazing AAA things again. What am I going to do? And then it was kind of in that low moment that I contacted Ian because I saw his thing, and I got to work on What Remains of Edith Finch, which was another highlight. And I think what I learned from that is you really have to think. You have to know what you need. So for some people, I bet they would have been perfectly happy at Amazon doing what I was doing. And there were a lot of amazing opportunities for innovation there. And there's great advice to, like, pay the bills. Don't, you can have the privilege to, like, worry about following your dreams. So everybody has to go on their own journey, but I think the fact that I had to ask myself what I needed in order to get out of bed in the morning, and that I have now as a result of asking those questions, I think that was what I learned most. And that may not be the answer that the question is looking for, but you really need to figure out to survive in this career what you need to get up on a daily basis. And it turned out for me that money was not that. It was making people happy and getting feedback from players that things that I've made are meaningful to them. And now I feel great because I got that. Amazing. And very fortunate for that. But I think if I hadn't gone through the dark times of realizing that I actually had no idea what I needed, that I wouldn't have gotten to that. But that makes sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I thought it was hard to talk about. So.
Yeah, no.
Now
great. I mean, but I think, so another question was about advice for avoiding and addressing burnout. Do you think that's sort of self-reflection and understanding what you're wanting to get out? And, is that part of that avoiding burnout, or are there other things that you think could help with that?
Yeah, it's definitely part of it. Burnout is definitely real. You need to figure out to avoid burnout, and I suffer from the occasional burnout. It's funny. I was thinking of doing like a little like 10-minute, those little 20 slides, 6-minute talk things, or whatever. I think of doing one of those on this topic. It's funny that you bring that up. I mean, I suffer from it sometimes, but I think for me anyway, the essential thing is it turns out that I need more than I'm still an idealist like I was when I was a punk rock teenager, and I wanted to change the world then, and I still kind of want to, and so having interests other than games and understanding how games tie to those interests, for me, is the answer a little bit. Other people need separation, right? Like I mentioned Kim. Right? Kim posts her Instagram all the time, these clay things that she makes. So she's got a healthy hobby and a healthy whatever. And I started doing Arduino projects because I was like, I need a hobby. And then I made a game with Arduino. So I was like, okay, I guess darn, I made everything about games again. So the GDC talk that I was going to give at this GDC that was canceled, that I'm still trying to figure out what to do with that content. It was an answer to the burnout question and the change the world question. So one of the things that I realized was that as a game systems designer, a game designer, I'm making structures that influence people's behavior. And at a conference called Project Horseshoe, Chelsea Howe gave this wonderful presentation about us using language like games are compelling, and that compulsion and to compel is a non-consensual word, and that Disney is careful about their language. They don't have users, they have guests, and they don't compel people to go to the theme park things. They have attractions and they invite people. And she really got me thinking a lot about how structures, I might have said before, how structures control behavior. I think now more about how structures invite behavior or influence behavior, and games share that with the law and economics and things that legit affect our world. And I'm sort of, one of the things I've been sort of having side conversations about for a good 3 years now. I think I mentioned it at the GDC Game Design Workshop Q&A wrap up. And so I finally decided to do a talk at GDC about it, and it got canceled. But I was talking about how the difference is we can't choose the structures that influence our behavior and our freedoms in the world that we're born into. We're born into that world. But what we can do is we can play a game and try on a different set of rules and see how that affects our behavior. And then we can play another game, we can play another game, we can play another game. And maybe if we play enough games, we will start to notice, hey, there was a rule that influenced my behavior in the real world. I can change that rule. We made up money. We made up rules. We made up laws. We made up all these things as much as we make up games. And so one of the things that's helping keep burnout away for me is the fact that I still want to make the world a better, safer, more just and equitable place, just like I did when I was an idealistic teenager. And I've kind of realized that my choice in career is a perfect opportunity for giving humanity more data on all the different ways we could structure things. So that's very motivating to me now.
Awesome. Well, maybe I'll kind of end with this. We had a lot of students, attend the conference and maybe people interested in getting into the game industry. So do you have some maybe advice for them, as a designer or getting into the industry? What do you, maybe some advice for the beginner out there?
Yeah, I was so worried about this because I used to think, I used to give that same advice that you always hear experienced people giving, which is, just make games, just do it. And then I can't remember somebody at GDC gave a talk about how that was terrible advice. So I'm going to give both bits of advice, which is, in 2020 hindsight, you can totally tell that I was meant to be a game designer because so many of the things that I did growing up in high school, in college, were about creating, and there was no game school. So, I didn't even think that you could make a living at it. I didn't think it was a career that existed. I don't know where I thought games came from, but I didn't think it was a job. So, but so many things were about manipulating rules, changing rules, creating interactivity. I thought I wanted to do theater when I was in high school and in college. And then if you look at all the things that I did in college, they were all about audience participation and like rule systems and consent, which is interesting. All those wrapped up. So there's a common thread that I was too blind in the moment to see. So piece of advice number one is, if you have the ability to tell yourself a narrative about how all of the things that you've made connect, keep doing that. So, because I don't think that you're going to be doing yourself any favors if you are a person who cares about, I don't know, soft games like the first speaker this morning. If you're interested in that, and then you end up working on for Konami on making slot machines harder to stop playing in Vegas, it won't feed your soul. There may be another person with another narrative, and that is the perfect thing for them, and that's just what they want, and it's a great fit for them. But you should really, if you have the opportunity, you should figure out what it is that you need, and then pursue that, whether that means working in it as on the side or applying for a job in that. And then if you're turned down, all the work that you've done on the side, keep doing that, because that will eventually impress somebody. And when I applied to Crystal, I did not think that coming from Breakaway on strategy games, there was any way I would get hired on action adventure, which is my passion. But when I was at Breakaway, one of my canceled projects was a third-person action adventure. So which I kind of manipulated the studio into getting me to prototype. And the fact that I had that, and I had that experience, and I had the screenshots, and I could talk about it intelligently from the perspective of not just as a player, but as a builder, worked. So, sorry, that's one set of advice. The other set of advice is I think that advice is wrong because there is really something to it in this industry that hitting a high quality bar is very hard, whether you're indie or AAA. It's very, 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 very hard. And there's a certain comfort, at least in AAA indie and AAA big, corporate. There's a certain comfort with people who understand where that quality bar lies. And so that's one of the reasons why you see why it's so difficult to hire people, and why you see such high rates of people not getting their first opportunity. So therefore, there's some comfort that a lot of hiring managers have when they see Call of Duty on a resume, or Jedi Fallen Order, or Tomb Raider, or Uncharted, or whatever, Ghost of Tsushima is about to come out. Even if it was QA, there is something, I mean, I hate to say this, but there is something to having that name on a resume, in the same way that depending on what college you go to, you have a different reaction. Or people are like, oh, you went to there, I guess you're good. That is a factor. And so if you can get one of those on your resume in any way, I honestly think that is good advice. It doesn't make me happy to say that, because I can think of many moments when I would have been miserable doing that. But I have to share it because it does work, and I see it work, and I see people getting hired based on minimal experience over people who look as good on paper because they've got that one thing on their resume. They've got a name on the resume. So that's some advice.
Okay. Yeah. Balance there, between those two approaches. Thank you. Yeah, this was awesome. This is a lot of great, valuable information, I think, for everybody watching out there, and hopefully on the recorded session as well. This was, I think, a really interesting sort of deep dive into the puzzles and really what people can take away from that, and then even just your experience with the industry. So it's been really great. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I feel like I went over time, and I'm not certain I shared stuff that is absolutely immediately applicable and useful, but I hope so, because I really love doing this sort of thing. So.